Hello, denizens. Did you like my comfy sweater? Well, I got an unhappy note from Netflix not too long ago that as of a certain date, Monty Python's Flying Circus, the series, was no longer going to be available. The series will have ceased to be on Netflix. It will have expired and gone to meet its maker. Bereft of streaming, it will be no more. It will have kicked the bucket. This is an X series. You will, no doubt, have recognized my purloining of the famous parrot sketch. Do not try this yourself. I am a professional comedian. Monty Python's importance to me and the rest of the Frantics comedy troupe of which I toiled for, on and off for 20 years, cannot be underestimated. I had watched the original series when it first appeared on the CBC here in Canada in 1971, 2 years after it debuted in the UK, and that would be 2 years before it showed up on select PBS stations in the US. I was in high school, and that was the last time I had watched all 45 shows, something like 50 years ago. Its removal from Netflix gave me the impetus to revisit them all without having to pay extra. I thought it would be an opportunity to watch it with more critical, experienced eyes and offer my thoughts on its 4-year run and why it was so successful and influential. I'm also going to explain some of the techniques they used and how, just being British gave them a wider comedy palette to work with. I'll also discuss why I thought it had run out of steam by its third series. If you are into comedy, this video will be mandatory viewing. It will be a veritable TED Talk on how to write a sketch. Are you ready? Let's go. The first thing I want to impart on you is that nothing happens in a vacuum. I won't go into the history of Python, but the UK had a rich history of live sketch comedy coming out of Oxford University and Cambridge. Silly, mostly sophomoric stuff with impressions of teachers they hated and lots of boys dressing up in women's clothing. Sound familiar? Yes, it was very much a boys' club. From this fertile soil, the likes of Beyond the Fringe had already bloomed. On radio, there was Spike Milligan's Goon Shows, the finest comedy that ever came from a mind suffering from World War II PTSD. If you catch just these two comedies, you will be better prepared for the Python era. Of greater influence would be Spike Milligan again, but his Q series, a TV show of utter insanity. The Pythons acknowledged the importance of Q. Most of you probably never heard of these antecedents, and that's my point. Python did not just appear out of nowhere. It stood on the many funny shoulders and made Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, and Michael Palin famous. Over here, on the other side of the Atlantic, Python was like a 16-ton weight had fallen on our heads. In the UK, it was no less shocking, partly because the shows it was competing against, like the Benny Hill Show, the Corbett Follies, the Dave Allen Show, the Frankie Howard Show, the Morecambe and Wise Show, and others of a similar mild ilk. While Benny Hill offered lots of women in bikinis and gartered stockings, it was, really sexless. Python offered this grade 11 naughty brain Gilliam's animations featuring nude subjects made from Renaissance paintings, which made it okay. The odd topless model, and of course the spectacular Carol Cleveland, who was up for every leering challenge. Who can forget the Milkman sketch? The juxtaposition of intellectual commentary and nudity was a joyous combination for us high school lads. We didn't care where the tits were sourced. The CBC must have noticed because the show was removed from primetime and relegated to the Friday midnight slot, which was perfect for us reprobates as we gathered every Friday at Peter Cook's mother's apartment, suitably stoned. Let's now go through the 4 series. I'll list some of my highlights for each of the series. Python managed to avoid the classic punchline trap. They even called attention to punchlines in a meta way. Bits didn't even have to be funny as long as they exploited outrageous premises. I'm fairly certain the boys thought everything they were writing was hilarious. I mean, they all had to universally approve 100% what would go on. But while many inevitably didn't work, they still contained enough well-crafted content to keep the show moving. We didn't shake our heads and go, oh, that sketch didn't work, because often they were, designed not to work in a traditional sense, giving the show an anarchic momentum of insanity interrupted by bits that became classics. It's best to look at Python as non-stop anarchy with periods of comprehensibility. By Series 4, with its shortened 6 episodes, it had lost its steam. Cleese left after Series 3, and 4 felt half-hearted, but we'll get to that. Series 1 gave us the following classics, according to me. Arthur Two Sheds Jackson, Funniest Joke in the World, Musical Mice, Marriage Guidance Counselor, Working Class Playwright, The Larch, Bicycle Repairman, Restaurant Sketch, Seduced Milkmen, Nudge Nudge, Self-Defense, Crunchy Frog, Turning into Scotsman, Blancmange Playing Tennis, Dead Parrot, Hell's Grannies, Man with a Tape Recorder Up His Nose, Twin Peaks of Kilimanjaro, Lumberjack Song, Horrible Visitors, Lingerie Shop Robbery, Vocational Guidance Counselor, Letters, Battle of Trafalgar, Gumbies, Battle of Pearl Harbor, Batley Townswomen's Guild, Falling from Building, Mr. Hilter, the Minehead by-election, Upper Class Twit of the Year, Ken Shabby, Albatross, Come Back to My Place, Historical Impersonations. I'm sure I missed some of your favorites, and many of the connecting bits were also funny, but I'm not listing them. Series 1 felt like the boys were finding their Monty Python groove. Many of the sketches felt like they could have come from their time at the Cambridge Footlights. Terry Gilliam was also hit and miss, but no one could take anything away from his brilliant sculpture ocarina animation. Tapping into Renaissance paintings and referencing philosophers made the show feel like it was high art, which even the Pythons admitted was a clever dodge. The one thing that was readily apparent was just how little budget they had for Series 1. We had better graphics on our cable show. The 16mm movies were rudimentary and grainy, still funny. The techniques the Pythons used are universal. Even you can easily apply them. Just send me money. No, this is free. Using subject matter that is recognized by a wide audience is actually the biggest challenge for comedy. The fewer things we have in common, the less we connect with the jokes. In the case of Pythons, we all know about Hitler, but do we know about BBC conventions? In the case of Python, they exaggerated politicians and BBC presenters, and we laughed even if we didn't know what we were laughing at or who we were laughing at. Arthur Two Sheds Jackson was a send-up of pompous BBC arts presenters. Funniest Joke in the World used juxtaposition combined with exaggeration by presenting one of the world's greatest evils, the Nazis, taking huge casualties when the British discovered a killer joke, which they translated into German and yelled it at the embedded Germans who laughed themselves to death. The part where the Germans, not known for their sense of humor, tried to come up with their own killer joke was a brilliant topper. It was supremely silly and set the tone for a very specific Python style. It traded on Britain's still fresh memory of past world wars. Juxtaposition is just the presentation of two diametrically opposed ideas forced together, one with greater gravitas than the other. The wider the gap, the funnier its potential. It's used frequently because it provides an instant laugh. Woody Allen was a brilliant practitioner of it. What if everything is an illusion and nothing exists? In that case, I definitely overpaid for my carpet. Allen loved contrasting the metaphysical with the mundane. They are very easy to write. You just have to find the best two things to contrast. Musical Mice was suitably gross. Gross is always funny. Marriage Guidance Counselor was a hilarious bit of naughtiness, and we got to look at Carol Cleveland's cleavage. Python often made fun of ineffectual men. The running gag of the larch made no sense, which is why it made sense. Bicycle Repairman was a straight-up juxtaposition play, a world populated by supermen capable of superhuman feats, but incapable of fixing a bicycle. Hence their call for Bicycle Repairman. Love the restaurant sketch. Its modus operandi was pure exaggeration, another important tool of a comedian. Seducing Milkmen was just an excuse to get Cleveland into some underthings. Nudge Nudge was a character piece featuring the verbose wordplay of Eric Idle. Idiots accosting men of stature was a popular theme. It's easy to recognize Eric Idle bits. It very much has the feeling of a Morecambe and Wise bit, who I don't think you've ever heard of, but they were the biggest stars in the UK. Now we come to self-defense, or as we like to call it, the banana sketch. How does one come up with a sketch like this? First of all, you're jotting down ideas constantly. If you don't have a notepad by your bed, then you're never going to be a writer. Assuming this was Cleese's bit, it would have all started with a simple, funny idea. How to defend yourself against a man armed with a banana. You're laughing already. Then you'd think of the environment to put it in. A military drill sergeant would be suitably ridiculous and instantly funny. It also provides a hint as to how to perform the characters. The premise is so strong that the sketch could have just started out with Cleese yelling, "Today I will teach you how to defend yourself against a man armed with a banana." The banter with the complaining recruits would remain intact, and you'd have a fine sketch. But Cleese chose to add a preamble that the drill sergeant was fixated on defending against assorted fruits. This is called exploration of the premise. It's a mandatory stage of comedy writing. You exhaust every possible gag and then cut it back to the best parts. What else can be said about the Dead Parrot sketch? Making fun of bad British customer service was also a repeating theme for the Pythons. Powerless men who resorted to eye-bulging yelling was a Cleese trademark. Man with a tape recorder up his nose was a wonderful sight gag, including a clever callback. The Lumberjack song was a classic. It used two common Python themes. One, it referenced an exotic location. For Brits, Canada was still a humorous colonial outpost. Two, the singer was gay. It was a cheap laugh, but who cares? Homosexuality was heavily referenced for laughs by most British comedians. Luckily, Python had their own poofter, Graham, for reference. The world of history was straight-up juxtaposition, with Carol Cleveland in Under Things presenting serious historical information while rolling about suggestively in bed. Once again, mixing educated dialogue with tits and ass for the win. Battle of Pearl Harbor, Batley Townswomen's Guild was another classic. Multiple juxtapositions were at play here. The mere idea of the Batley Townswomen's Guild performing the Battle of Pearl Harbor, and then the subsequent reveal of men in drag rolling around in the mud, hitting each other with purses. It did not get more historically accurate than that. Then there was Mr. Hilter, with a familiar-sounding name, running for a local by-election. It was pretty shocking when I first saw it, not for resurrecting Hitler and Nazi uniforms, but having concentration camp jokes. What can be said about the upper class twit of the year? This was very British, but we got it. It gave us a window into the UK's class system. The Pythons were lucky to be able to ply their trade in an ethnocentric environment where most people understood the references. They had a rich vein to tap, which included the royalty, religion, classism, politicians, the parochial BBC, schools with uniforms, scars from fairly recent world wars, and a history that included kings, queens, Roman conquerors, and Vikings. And then there were the legends and the entire works of Shakespeare, including a vast literary tradition. Python had all that available to them, including a collection of the most delicious accents. Neither Canada nor the United States can match that. We barely know our own history. I hope that gave you some insights into the Pythons and the mechanisms they employed. But none of their wonderful writing would have been of value if they couldn't perform the material. While we love them all, I got to meet Michael Palin and wrote sketches for the wonderful Graham Chapman. There's no question that John Cleese was the linchpin. Would Python have become as popular without him? I'll leave that to you in the comments section. Let's go through highlights of Series 2. Ministry of Silly Walks, The Piranha Brothers, The Spanish Inquisition, The Semaphore version of Wuthering Heights, Deja Vu, Chrysalis Animation, Gumby Intros, Architect Sketch, The Bishop, Blackmail, Rich Caught on Film, Boxer Documentary, Spot on Face, Silly and Sensible Parties, Attila the Hun Show, Secretary of State Striptease, Killer Sheep, Village Idiots, Take Your Pick Game Show, Archaeology Today, Poof Judges, Beethoven. Now for something completely different bikini opening, Bruce's, Naughty Bits, Camp It Up, Killer Cars, underwater production of Measure for Measure, Penguin on the Television, Dancing Teeth, Fish License, Krelm Toothpaste, How Not to Be Seen, Dirty Hungarian Phrasebook, Communist Quiz, Gumby Flower Arranging, Spam. How Long Is It? Undertaker Sketch. What a bounty of classic sketches came out of Series 2. You could tell they found the rhythm that they were aiming for. The classic sketches were still there and strong, but there were more long-form experiments. The connected gags were better integrated. Lots of tiny filler callbacks and sight gags. Series 2 felt more confident. They became more playful with titles and credits, moving them about the show, spent more time playing with the conventions of TV. Terry Gilliam found his animation groove in Series 2 in look and execution. What can one say about the silly walk sketch that became so famous that it was the bane of Cleese wherever he went? The Piranha Brothers provided endless quotable material. The most feared, of course, was Doug Piranha, who used sarcasm and irony. The sketch was inspired by the Kray twins' notorious gangsters from the East End of London in the 1950s. And, speaking of quotable, how about that Spanish Inquisition no one suspects? You can tell that Gilliam had made leaps from Series 1. The Chrysalis Animation was a classic, as was The Killer Cars. The Deja Vu running gag was very funny. The Gumbies debuted. The Architect Sketch must be top 10. The Bishop was perfect with its send-up of the Saint opening title sequence. Blackmail was another classic, probably top 10. Python loved their unctuous BBC presenters, especially the ones in sparkly outfits. Boxer Documentary was another long-form success. The Now for something completely different, panning of women in bikinis opening, finishing off with the now classic Cleese in a white bikini shot. The endlessly quoted Bruce's sketch, a classic juxtaposition example, rough and tumble outback Aussies teaching Hegelian positivism. Camp It Up was a top 10 favorite. How many of us screamed, "What's on the telly? A penguin is on the telly!" Cleese wanting a license for his pet fish Eric. How Not to Be Seen got its laughs from the locked-off camera. The Dirty Hungarian phrasebook is top 10 for me, even if Cleese's accent was horrible. My parents were Hungarian. I have to mention Spam, as we can thank the Pythons for inspiring those hated emails. Finishing off Series 2 with the Undertaker sketch, where we learned the phrase, "she's an eater." Hopefully you can see the techniques used in their bits. The genius was in their original premises and execution. That's the hard part. The challenge for the Frantics was there anything out there that the Pythons had not done already? Let's head into Series 3 highlights. Apologizing for Mass Murder, Icelandic Saga, Mrs. Premise and Mrs. Conclusion Visit Jean-Paul Sartre, Wicker's World, How to Rid the World of All Diseases, Mrs. Bader Explodes, Life of Tchaikovsky, Fish Slapping Dance, Money Song, Elizabeth L. on Scooters, Argument Clinic, which includes hitting on the head lessons, Man Who Speaks in Anagrams, Merchant Banker, Summarizing Proust, Everest Climbed by Hairdressers, Watney's Red Barrel, Theory of the Brontosaurus, Mollusks Documentary, Biggles Dictates a Letter, Climbing the North Face of Uxbridge Road, Old Lady Snoopers, Storage Jars, Cheese Shop, Sam Peckinpah's Salad Days, Apology, Bicycle Tour, Olympic Hide and Seek, The Cheap Laughs, Boxing Tonight, Bottle versus Sir Kenneth Clark, Dennis Moore, the Lupin sketch, Kamikaze Scotsman, No Time to Lose, Unexploded Scotsman, Rival Documentaries, The Oscar Wilde sketch, Charwoman, New Brain from Curry's, Dirty Vicar sketch. Series 3 was a mixed bag. It became more cerebral, longer-form sketches dominated. I got the sense that they were trying to break away from the cheap wins juxtaposition gags provided. Filmed bits became more cinematic. While it had no shortage of memorable signature Python material, I also got the sense they were getting a bit tired of it all. Of notable merit were Mrs. Premise and Mrs. Conclusion Visit Jean-Paul Sartre. The Pepper Pots were a hilarious mainstay. Perhaps the shortest sketch the Pythons did was the fish slapping dance. It was incomprehensibly funny, but it works. Argument Clinic was top 10 without question. Idol's impossibly long rant in the travel agency was also top 10, and an album mainstay. Have I run out of top 10 space yet? Anne Elk from Archaeology Today was wonderfully stupid, featuring a struggling presenter trying to extract something useful from a lunatic claiming to be an expert. More Pepper Pots with Old Lady Snoopers, the highlight featuring Cleese and Chapman hitting their children off camera and eating a Vermeer. The Cheese Shop might be top 2, up there with the Parrot sketch. And who can forget the fine day out in the park that turns into a violent, bloody disaster in the hands of director Sam Peckinpah? Dennis Moore stealing Lupins might be the best remembered for its musical theme. Dennis Moore, riding through the glen. I won't sing anymore. Rival Documentaries was just plain genius. I'm including the Dirty Vicar sketch because it had a vicar and it was dirty. People putting up with clergy grabbing women's breasts was actually titillatingly, cleverly wrapped in social commentary. Here are some of my favorites from Series 4. trivializing the war, Woody and tinny words, Hamlet, bogus psychiatrists, Live from Epsom, Queen Victoria Handicap, Mr. Neutron, The Most Awful Family in Britain, Brigadier and the Bishop, Slowest Cannon, Man Who Finishes Other People's Sentences. Notwithstanding the fact that it was a shortened season with only 6 episodes, there was not much to choose from. Hamlet was reasonable, but I'm highlighting it for special attention because it featured a 1965 Chevrolet Impala, which was the same car I owned. The Queen Victoria Handicap was funny, but also lazy juxtaposition, but it's a favorite of everybody's. Gilliam's excruciatingly slow canon animation was brilliant. The show featuring Mr. Neutron I really loved, and The Most Awful Family in Britain was funny because of its sustained noise level and Chapman's getup. But Series 4 was definitely slim pickings. Series 4 actually started with the golden age of ballooning. I didn't like it back in 1974, and I didn't much like it now. Episode 2, called The Michael Ellis Show, also left me cold. One big omission, of course, was the lack of John Cleese. By the start of Series 3, Cleese was growing tired of dealing with Chapman's alcoholism. He felt, too, that the show's scripts had declined in quality. He also wanted to do solo projects. Fawlty Towers would premiere on the BBC in September in 1975. For those who are counting, this was the very last image you will have seen after 45 shows. Kind of an anticlimax, but then again, perhaps this was the most fitting way to end the series. Yes, Series 4 was not their best effort, but as we all know, the Pythons went on to bless us with some classic movies. My overall thoughts are that the shows hold up really well. I never knew the small towns they were referencing, nor the names of British personalities and cricketers back in the day. I'm actually surprised the Rainbow Nazis haven't gone after the show today. None of the living Pythons have come out to say they would not do any of those bits again. In fact, Cleese refused to delete the trans parody from a live version of The Life of Brian. I love comedy. Unfortunately, we are experiencing a severe comedy drought of late. While we wait for the next humor messiah to take us to the promised land, I heartily recommend watching Monty Python's Flying Circus. Till next time, denizens, be seeing you. Whew, that was a long one.